It all started with a feeling of nagging, gut-wrenching suspicion that something wasn't right. My wife Sarah had been distant lately. The warmth in her eyes had faded, replaced by a coldness I couldn't quite place. We'd built a life together, a successful company, a beautiful home, and a daughter we both adored. But lately, it felt like I was living with a stranger. At first, I told myself it was just a phase. Maybe the stress of running the company was getting to her. Or perhaps it was the weight of parenthood, the endless responsibilities that came with raising a child. But as the days turned into weeks, the distance between us only grew. She stopped asking about my day, stopped sharing hers. Our conversations became superficial, limited to the bare necessities: what to eat, who would pick up our daughter from school, whether the bills had been paid. I tried to bridge the gap, to reconnect with her. I planned date nights, surprised her with little gifts, even suggested we take a family vacation. But every effort was met with indifference. She'd smile politely, thank me, and then retreat into herself, as if she were somewhere else entirely. It was like trying to hold onto smoke. No matter how tightly I grasped, it slipped through my fingers. Then there were the late-night phone calls. At first, I didn't think much of them. We both had demanding jobs, and it wasn't unusual for work-related calls to come in at odd hours. But these calls were different. She'd take them in another room, her voice hushed, her tone urgent. When I asked who it was, she'd brush me off with vague answers, just work stuff or nothing important. But the way she'd glance at me, almost guiltily, made my stomach churn. I began to notice other things too, the way she'd flinch when I touched her, as if my hand were a burning brand instead of a loving caress. The way she'd suddenly become interested in our financial documents, asking detailed questions about the company's accounts, our investments, even my personal savings. At the time, I thought she was just being proactive, maybe trying to take a more active role in managing our finances. But looking back, I realized it was all part of a larger plan, a plan I was too blind to see. The hardest part was the way she used our daughter against me. Emily was my world, my everything. From the moment she was born, I vowed to protect her, to give her the best life possible. But Sarah began to subtly undermine that bond. She'd make offhand comments about how I wasn't spending enough time with Emily, how I was too focused on work to be a good father. At first, I believed her. I felt guilty, ashamed even, and tried to make up for it by being more present, more involved. But then the accusations started. Small at first, implying that I was too strict, too harsh with Emily. Then they escalated, becoming more pointed, more sinister. She'd suggest that I was too close to Emily, that my affection was inappropriate. I was horrified. How could she even think that Emily was my daughter, my little girl? The idea that anyone, least of all Sarah, could twist my love into something ugly was unbearable. I tried to reason with her, to understand where this was coming from. But every conversation turned into an argument. Every attempt to defend myself only seemed to make things worse. She'd twist my words, turn them against me, until I felt like I was losing my mind. I started to question myself, to wonder if maybe I was doing something wrong without realizing it. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about Emily. This wasn't even about me. This was about something else, something darker, more calculated. I just didn't know what it was yet. The breaking point came one evening when I overheard Sarah talking on the phone. She thought I was in the shower, but I'd stepped out to grab something from the bedroom. Her voice was low, but I caught snippets of the conversation. Trust me, it's going to work. He'll never see it coming. Once we have everything, my blood ran cold. Who was she talking to? What was she planning? I wanted to confront her, to demand answers. But something stopped me. Maybe it was fear of what I might discover, fear of losing the life we built together. Or maybe it was instinct, a survival mechanism telling me to tread carefully, to gather evidence before making a move. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The woman sleeping beside me wasn't the Sarah I'd married. She was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. And as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, I knew our marriage was hanging by a thread. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The storm was brewing, and I was about to be caught in its eye. But for now, all I could do was wait, watch, and hope that my instincts were wrong. Because if they weren't, my life as I knew it was about to come crashing down. The day everything changed started like any other. I was in my home office, reviewing company reports, when Sarah stormed in. Her face was twisted with anger, but there was something else in her eyes, a calculated coldness that sent chills down my spine. She didn't even bother to knock, just barged in like a hurricane, her presence filling the room with tension. Before I could say a word, she launched into her accusation. The words hit me like a sledgehammer, leaving me gasping for air. She claimed I had molested our daughter, Emily. My mind reeled, struggling to process what she was saying. How could she even think that Emily was my world, my everything? The idea that I would harm her in any way was unthinkable, monstrous. I tried to reason with her, to understand where this was coming from. "Sarah, you know that's not true," I said, my voice trembling. "I would never hurt Emily. You know that." But she wasn't listening. Her eyes were hard, her expression unyielding. She had already made up her mind, and nothing I said could change it. She began listing evidence, things she claimed proved her accusation. The way I hugged Emily too tightly, the way I spent too much time with her, the way I looked at her. Each word felt like a dagger, cutting deeper into my soul. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These were normal, loving actions between a father and his daughter. How could she twist them into something so vile? I felt a mix of emotions: anger, confusion, betrayal. But above all, I felt fear. Fear for Emily, fear for myself, fear for what this accusation could do to our family. I knew how these things worked. Once an accusation like this was made, it didn't matter if it was true or not. The damage would be done, and it would be irreversible. Sarah's voice grew louder, more insistent. She threatened to go to the police, to take Emily away from me, to ruin my reputation. Her words were like a battering ram, breaking down the walls of my composure. I felt myself crumbling under the weight of her accusations, my mind racing to find a way out of this nightmare. But amidst the chaos, something clicked. This wasn't about Emily. This wasn't even about me. This was about something else, something darker, more calculated. Sarah wasn't just accusing me, she was setting me up. And I had no idea how far she was willing to go. I thought back to the signs I'd been ignoring, the late-night phone calls, the sudden interest in our finances, the way she'd been distancing herself from me. It all started to make sense. This wasn't a spontaneous accusation. It was part of a plan, a carefully orchestrated scheme to destroy me. But why? What could possibly drive her to do something like this? The answer came to me in a flash. Mark, her so-called friend from work. I'd never liked the guy, but I'd always dismissed my suspicions as jealousy. Now, I wasn't so sure. I needed proof. I couldn't just sit back and let her destroy my life without a fight. But how? I couldn't confront her directly. She'd just deny everything and use it against me. I needed to be smarter, more strategic. That's when the idea hit me. I needed to record her. If she was planning something, if she was working with Mark, I needed evidence to expose her. It felt wrong, sneaky, but I didn't see any other way. This was about survival, about protecting myself and my daughter. I waited until Sarah left the room, then quickly set up a voice recorder on my phone. I hid it in a drawer, making sure it was out of sight but still within range. My hands were shaking as I did it, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt like a criminal, like I was the one doing something wrong. But I pushed those feelings aside. This was necessary. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sarah's accusation hung over me like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over everything I did. I tried to act normal, to go about my day as if nothing had happened, but it was impossible. Every time I looked at Emily, I felt a pang of guilt, as if I'd somehow failed her by letting things get to this point. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. All I could do was replay Sarah's words over and over in my head, trying to make sense of them. But amidst the turmoil, there was a glimmer of hope. I had a plan now. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her destroy me. I was going to fight back, to expose the truth, no matter what it took. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The storm was brewing, and I was about to be caught in its eye. But for now, all I could do was wait, watch, and hope that my instincts were right. Because if they were, my life as I knew, it was about to come crashing down. In the days that followed, I became a prisoner in my own home. Sarah's accusations spread like wildfire, poisoning the minds of everyone around me. Friends, colleagues, even some family members looked at me with suspicion. I felt like I was drowning, desperate for a lifeline. The weight of her words was suffocating. Everywhere I went, I could feel the stares, the whispers, the judgment. People I'd known for years suddenly avoided me, as if I were some kind of monster. It was isolating, humiliating, and utterly devastating. I tried to hold my head high, to act like nothing was wrong, but inside, I was falling apart. Emily was the only bright spot in my life during those dark days. She was too young to understand what was happening, and her innocence was a balm to my wounded soul. But even she seemed to sense that something was off. She'd ask why Mommy was so angry, why Daddy looked so sad. I didn't know how to answer her, so I'd just hug her tightly and tell her everything would be okay. But deep down, I wasn't sure if it ever would be. Sarah's behavior only grew more erratic. She'd alternate between cold indifference and outright hostility, as if she were playing some twisted game. One moment, she'd ignore me completely, acting like I didn't exist. The next, she'd lash out with venomous accusations, her words cutting deeper than any knife. I tried to stay strong, to focus on gathering evidence, but it was hard. Every day felt like a battle, a fight to keep my sanity intact. I'd replay the recording I'd made over and over, listening for any clue, any hint of what she was planning. But so far, there was nothing concrete, just vague threats and cryptic comments. Then, one evening, everything changed. I was in the living room, pretending to read a book while secretly keeping an eye on Sarah. She was on the phone again, her voice low and urgent. I strained to hear what she was saying, but she was too far away. Frustrated, I decided to take a risk. I quietly slipped my phone out of my pocket and opened the voice recorder app. Then, I casually walked past her, pretending to head to the kitchen. As I passed, I subtly placed the phone on the coffee table, making sure it was angled toward her. It was a risky move. If she noticed, it would all be over, but I had to know what she was saying. I lingered in the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. Every second felt like an eternity as I waited for her to finish the call. Finally, I heard her hang up. I waited a few more minutes, then casually walked back into the living room and retrieved my phone. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I listened to the recording. What I heard made my blood run cold. Sarah was talking to Mark, her so-called friend from work. Their conversation was chillingly casual, as if they were discussing the weather instead of my destruction. They talked about the accusations, about how they were going to use them to ruin me. They talked about the company, about how they planned to take control of it once I was out of the picture. And they talked about Emily, about how they were going to use her to manipulate me. Listening to them, I felt a mix of emotions: rage, betrayal, heartbreak. But amidst the pain, there was also relief. I finally had proof of their lies, their manipulation, their greed. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed to know the full extent of their plan, to understand how far they were willing to go. So I kept recording, kept gathering evidence. Every conversation, every interaction, I documented it all. It wasn't easy. The stress was overwhelming, the fear constant. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. But I couldn't stop. This was about more than just me. It was about Emily, about protecting her from the chaos Sarah was creating. As the days turned into weeks, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Sarah and Mark weren't just planning to ruin me. They were planning to take everything. My wealth, my company, even my daughter. They were going to use the accusations to discredit me, to make me look like a monster. And once I was out of the way, they were going to step in and take control. It was a horrifying realization, but it also gave me clarity. I knew what I was up against now, and I knew what I had to do. I began to prepare for the battle ahead. I consulted with lawyers, gathered financial documents, and made sure Emily was safe and protected. I also made copies of the recordings, storing them in multiple places to ensure they couldn't be destroyed. But the hardest part was keeping up the facade. I had to act like everything was normal, like I didn't know what Sarah was planning. It was exhausting, pretending to be the oblivious husband while secretly gathering evidence against my own wife. But I didn't have a choice. This was my only chance to protect myself, to protect Emily, to protect everything I'd worked so hard to build. And so, I waited, I watched, I recorded. The storm was coming, and I was ready to face it. But little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The truth was darker than I could have ever imagined, and it was about to shatter everything I thought I knew. The footage was damning. Sarah and Mark, plotting together in our living room, their voices dripping with venom. They weren't just trying to destroy my reputation, they were planning to take everything from me. My wealth, my company, even my daughter. I had installed hidden cameras around the house, determined to uncover the truth. What I discovered was beyond anything I could have imagined. The recordings captured their every word, every gesture, every cold, calculated move. They spoke about me as if I were already gone, as if I were nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. Listening to them, I felt a mix of emotions: rage, betrayal, heartbreak. But amidst the pain, there was also relief. I finally had proof of their lies, their manipulation, their greed. The first recording was the most shocking. Sarah and Mark sat on the couch, their heads close together as they whispered. They talked about the accusations, about how they were going to use them to ruin me. "Once the police get involved, he'll be finished," Sarah said, her voice cold and detached. "No one will believe him after that." Mark nodded, a smug smile on his face. "And once he's out of the picture, we can take control of the company. It'll be easy." I felt a surge of anger as I listened to them, my hands clenched into fists. How could they be so callous, so cruel? But the worst was yet to come. They began to talk about Emily, about how they were going to use her to manipulate me. "He'll do anything to protect her," Sarah said. "We can use that to our advantage." Mark agreed. "Yeah, we'll make him think he has no choice. He'll hand over everything just to keep her safe." I felt sick to my stomach. How could Sarah use our daughter like that? How could she be so heartless? But the recordings didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I captured more conversations, each one more damning than the last. They talked about forging documents, about manipulating witnesses, about using the media to smear my name. They even discussed how they were going to divide my assets once I was out of the way. It was a horrifying glimpse into their twisted minds, a chilling reminder of just how far they were willing to go. But amidst the horror, there was also a sense of clarity. I finally understood what I was up against, and I knew what I had to do. I began to prepare for the battle ahead. I consulted with lawyers, gathered financial documents, and made sure Emily was safe and protected. I also made copies of the recordings, storing them in multiple places to ensure they couldn't be destroyed. But the hardest part was keeping up the facade. I had to act like everything was normal, like I didn't know what Sarah was planning. It was exhausting, pretending to be the oblivious husband while secretly gathering evidence against my own wife. Every day was a struggle. I'd wake up with a knot in my stomach, dreading what the day might bring. I'd force myself to smile, to act like nothing was wrong, even as my mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. Sarah, of course, was oblivious. She continued with her plan, confident that she had the upper hand. She'd make snide comments, drop subtle hints, all designed to keep me off balance. But I played along, biding my time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Emily was my only solace during those dark days. Her innocence, Her unconditional love kept me grounded. I'd hold her close, whispering promises that everything would be okay, even as I wondered if I could keep them. But amidst the chaos, there was also a sense of determination. I wasn't going to let Sarah and Mark win. I wasn't going to let them destroy everything I'd worked so hard to build. The day of reckoning was coming, and I was ready. I had the evidence, the plan, the resolve. All I needed was the right moment. And then it happened. Sarah called a meeting with our lawyers, ready to present her case and strip me of everything. She was smug, confident, convinced that she had already won. But what she didn't know was that I had a bombshell of my own. As she stood there, laying out her accusations, I played the recording. The room fell silent as her voice echoed through the speakers, exposing her for the liar she was. The look on her face, shock, fear, and finally, defeat was something I'll never forget. In that moment, I knew I had won. But the victory was bittersweet. The scars of betrayal run deep, and I know I'll never be the same. This wasn't just a story about cheating or greed. It was a lesson in trust, resilience, and the lengths some people will go to for power. And while I may have won the battle, the war left me forever changed. The day of reckoning came sooner than I expected. Sarah had called a meeting with our lawyers, ready to present her case and strip me of everything. She was smug, confident, convinced that she had already won. But what she didn't know was that I had a bombshell of my own. The room was tense as we all gathered around the table. Sarah sat at one end, her posture rigid, her expression cold. Mark was there too, sitting beside her like some kind of twisted ally. I could see the confidence in their eyes, the belief that they had outmaneuvered me. But I kept my composure, my face neutral, my hands steady. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and I wasn't about to let them see me falter. Sarah began her presentation, laying out her accusations with a calm, calculated precision. She spoke about the supposed evidence, about how I had betrayed her trust, about how I was a danger to our daughter. Her words were sharp, cutting, designed to wound, but I didn't react. I just sat there listening, waiting for the right moment. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. The lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to proceed. That's when I made my move. "Before we go any further," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I think there's something you all need to hear." I pulled out my phone and connected it to the speaker system in the room. Sarah's eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence wavering. And then I pressed play. The room was filled with the sound of Sarah's voice, cold and calculating, as she plotted with Mark to destroy me. The recordings were crystal clear, leaving no room for doubt. I watched as the color drained from Sarah's face, as her hands began to tremble. Mark looked like he wanted to bolt from the room, but he was frozen in place, his eyes wide with shock. The lawyers listened in stunned silence, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief to outright horror. When the recordings ended, the room was dead silent. No one knew what to say. I broke the silence. "As you can see," I said, my voice steady, "these accusations are nothing more than a calculated attempt to destroy me and take control of my assets. Sarah and Mark have been conspiring against me for months, and I have the evidence to prove it." Sarah finally found her voice. "That's not true," she shouted, her voice shaking with desperation. "He's lying. He's trying to frame me." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The lawyers had heard enough. They began to ask questions, their tones sharp and accusatory. Sarah and Mark stumbled over their answers, their lies unraveling with every word. I sat back and watched as the truth came to light. It was a surreal moment, watching the woman I had once loved crumble under the weight of her own deceit. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. Just a deep, aching sadness. The meeting ended with the lawyers advising Sarah to drop her accusations and seek legal counsel. Mark left without a word, his face pale, his hands trembling. Sarah stayed behind, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and fear. "How could you do this?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "How could you betray me like this?" I looked at her, my heart heavy. "You did this to yourself, Sarah," I said quietly. "I didn't want it to come to this, but you left me no choice." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine for some sign of the man she had once known. But that man was gone, shattered by her betrayal. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal. Sarah's accusations were discredited, her reputation in tatters. Mark was fired from his job, his career ruined. And I was left to pick up the pieces of my life. It wasn't easy. The scars of betrayal run deep, and they don't heal overnight. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when I wondered if I would ever be able to trust again. But through it all, there was one thing that kept me going, Emily. She was my anchor, my reason to keep fighting. I knew I had to be strong for her, to show her that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. In the end, justice was served. Sarah and Mark were exposed, and I was able to protect what mattered most, my daughter and my legacy. But the cost was high. The woman I had loved, the life we had built together, was gone forever. This wasn't just a story about cheating or greed. It was a lesson in trust, resilience, and the lengths some people will go to for power. And while I may have won the battle, the war left me forever changed. But I'm still standing, and for now, that's enough.